In the previous episodes of the history of Islam, we recounted the various developments that have shaped the core of Islamic identity. In episode 1, we explained the foundations of the Caliphate by Khalifa Abu Bakr. Following this, we described the territorial expansions and the origins of Islamic jurisprudence by Khalif Umar. In the third episode, we recounted the evolution of the Islamic civilization by Khalif Uthman. And in the previous episode, we explained how the Islamic civil war between Khalif Ali and Governor Muawiyah laid the groundwork for the schism between Sunni and Shia Islam. Following Ali's victory in El Nahrawan against the radical Khawarji group, the latter planned the assassination of the Khalif. 2 years later, a Khajarid follower stabbed Ali with a poisoned dagger. Ali passed away in a few days, but his death left behind a power vacuum and a fragmented state. Welcome to a Caspian Report by me, Shirvan. However, the death of Ali was not to be the end of the Shiites, for Ali also left behind two sons, Hasan and Husayn. Following the death of the fourth Caliph and the first Imam, the partisans of Ali immediately looked to his eldest son, Hassan, as the rightful successor and named him the second Imam. Yet Hassan, exhausted from war and overtaken by grief, argued that taking power now would constitute as a political power grab, which would have disgraced the memory of his father. Instead of continuing the war, Hassan reached an agreement with Muawiyah and stepped aside. The governor had finally realized his ambition. He would become the next Khalif. However, there were conditions. Hassan was given the authority over the region of Kufa, and the tax collection in this region was deemed for him and his Shiite community. More importantly, the agreement stated that Khalif Muawiyah would have no right to appoint a successor, and that after his reign, Hassan was to rule as the sixth Khalif. This final point is critical to understand because it was meant to prevent the rise of the Umayyad monarchy. All in all, the agreement became known as the Hassan-Muawiyah Treaty. For this compromise, Hassan is recognized as Hassan the Peacemaker. In the year 662, with no other contender left, Muawiyah was crowned as the Khalif in Jerusalem. During the ceremony of his crowning, he held a speech and explained that unlike the previous Khalifs, his legacy would be determined not by expanding the foundations of Islamic identity, but by bringing glory and fortune to the Islamic world. The quote reads as the following: "I have desired the way followed by Abu Bakr and Umar, but I was unable to follow it. And so I have followed a course with you which contains fortune and benefits for you despite some bias. So be pleased with what comes to you from me, even if it is little. When good is continuous, even if it is little, it enriches. Discontent makes life grim." Even though the Shiites perceive Muawiyah as a usurper, the new Khalif would continue on to become one of the most accomplished and skillful leaders in history. Once he settled in his office, Muawiyah turned his attention to the Byzantines. He conquered a number of strategic islands in the Mediterranean Sea, thereby securing the long-term naval interests of the Caliphate. Muawiyah kept pushing against the boundaries of the Byzantine Empire with a vengeance. In fact, roughly a decade after taking power in 674, Muawiyah sponsored a siege of Constantinople. Even though the siege against the Byzantine capital failed, it came strikingly close to victory. Throughout his reign, the Khalif sent a number of military expeditions in the Maghreb region and even established military outposts in present-day Tunisia. This further accelerated the colonization efforts in the Iberian coastal towns and would lay the foundations for the military conquest of the Iberian Peninsula in 711. However, Muawiyah also understood that the conquered indigenous Christians would only remain content if they enjoyed religious freedoms. Thus, Muawiyah continued the policy set by Umar. Minorities were allowed to practice their traditions, religions, and laws. This level of freedom is what allowed the Caliph to extensively focus on conquests of new territories without concern for losing control over the realm. All in all, the borders of the state expanded, trade and finances flourished, and along with it, the wealth and power of the Arab nobility. But Muawiyah's rule was challenged by the radical Khawarij movement, who would continuously start revolts throughout the state. Furthermore, due to the bitter conflict with the Byzantine Empire, trade and communications between the Middle East and Europe were cut off, and they would never again recover. Both regions would develop separate civilizations. And as for the Shiites, they would become second-class citizens in the new Caliphate. Towards the end of the first decade that Muawiyah reigned the Caliphate, it became clear that Hasan, who was 45 years, would outlive Muawiyah, who was 68 years. It was only a matter of time before Hasan would take the helm of the Caliphate. For Muawiyah, this was a disastrous outcome. It meant that everything he had worked for, the glory, fortune, and nobility, would be in vain. The only way to ensure the continuation of his legacy and that of the Umayyad family was to nominate his eldest son Yazid as his heir. But the treaty with Hasan formed a major obstacle to this plan. As for Hasan, ever since abdicating power to Muawiyah, he and his brother Husayn lived in Medina. They kept a low profile and stayed out of the politics of the state. What happened next is disputed by both sides. The official story is that Hasan ate or drank something and he became seriously ill. Hasan sensed that death was imminent. How it happened, we don't know. Even Hasan himself wasn't sure, since on his deathbed, Hasan refused to name his suspect to his brother Husayn for fear that the wrong person be killed in revenge. However, most historians argued that the death of Hasan was in no way a coincidence. In fact, it was orchestrated by Muawiyah, who persuaded either a servant or one of the wives of Hasan to poison him. After all, coincidences involving Muawiyah have very little ground. Either way, in the year 670, Hasan, the second Imam and sixth Caliph to be, passed away. But before he died, he passed the torch of succession to his brother Husayn. Thus, Husayn was now designated as the third Imam, the one who was to continue the lineage of Muhammad and Ali. The reign of Muawiyah would extend for another decade. Following the death of Hasan, Muawiyah felt that he was no longer obliged by the treaty he signed with Hasan. Thus, Muawiyah proceeded to nominate his eldest son Yazid I as the next Caliph. But, for the sake of formality, Muawiyah had gathered the prominent tribal Arab leaders and set up a Shura election council. There was a brief moment of optimism as the tribal leaders started discussing the new candidates for the office of Caliph. Then, suddenly, a bodyguard of Muawiyah stood up and called for attention. As he walked slowly around the circle table, staring every tribal leader in the eye, the bodyguard pulled out his sword and threatened the council members to vote for Muawiyah's eldest son. The ploy worked. The Shura Council went through the proper democratic forms and chose Yazid to be their next Caliph. A major chapter in Islamic history had ended. The Shura Council would never again be summoned, and the brief social experiment with democracy gave way to dynastic succession. Muawiyah would be succeeded by his son Yazid, who in turn would be succeeded by his son, and so the inheritance would continue on by the Umayyad family. In every practical sense, Muawiyah's rise to power was the death of the Islamic Caliphate and the birth of the Islamic Empire. On his deathbed in 680, Muawiyah held a conversation with his son in which he warned Yazid against mistreating Husayn. It reads as the following: "As for Husayn, what can I tell you concerning him? Be careful not to confront him except in a good way. Extend to him a free hand and let him roam the earth as he pleases. Do not harm him, yet show him the thunder and lightning. Never confront him with the weapons of war, but rather bestow on him generous gifts. Give him a place of honor near you and treat him with due reverence. Be careful, O my son, that you do not meet God with his blood, lest you be amongst those that will perish." When Yazid succeeded his father, the first thing he did was to ask all the governors to take an oath of allegiance to him. Every governor from every corner of the Caliphate pledged his allegiance to the sixth Caliph and showered him with gifts. However, Yazid's only concern was the fealty of Husayn, who had refused to bend the knee. Yazid, who was a military man and fought in many battles during the conquests of his father, was a man described as strong, capable, and brave, but he was also a man who was harsh, ruthless even, and he drank. He was the kind of man who perceived the very existence of Husayn as a threat to his reign. Husayn, who still lived in Medina, soon learned of an assassination attempt on his life sponsored by the Caliph. Now, Husayn had enough. He left Medina to seek safety in Mecca. Once he arrived in his destination, Husayn openly declared that the appointment of Yazid as the Caliph was against the teachings of Islam and that he was going to challenge Yazid. A number of top figures approached Husayn and pledged their fealties to him. Furthermore, Husayn received letters from Kufa where the local people were asking for his support against the Umayyads. According to the initial letters, about 18,000 men from Kufa had already pledged their allegiance to Husayn and asked him to visit Kufa. It became apparent that many people considered Husayn as the legitimate successor. There was only one way to be sure. The third Imam gathered his family, friends, and followers, and with a company of roughly 70 to 150 people set out for Kufa. Even at the time it seemed like a David and Goliath story. Husayn, who had no troops, set out on a quest to overthrow the mighty tyrant. It is hard to imagine what the plan was. It may seem as if Husayn intended to start a firestorm of revolt by inspiring the local tribes to join him, but just before he left for Kufa, Husayn gave a final sermon. He said that if he, the son of Ali and the grandson of Muhammad, could not stand up to tyranny, then who would? He continued and mentioned how he was sure to be slain. It reads as the following: "The death is a certainty for mankind, just like the trace of necklace on the neck of young girls. And I am enamored of my ancestors like the eagerness of Jacob to Joseph. Everyone who is going to devote his blood for our sake and is prepared to meet Allah must depart with us." In a sense, it was more of a farewell speech. For this reason, Husayn's journey to Kufa was not so much a quest to overthrow the Umayyads, but rather a symbolic sacrifice to humankind. Despite all the advice against traveling to Kufa, Husayn set forth. When the Caliph caught news of this development, he gave the order to crush Husayn and his followers. On their way to Kufa, which was only 2 days away, Husayn's company encountered the Kufan army, who had pleaded for Husayn's visit earlier. Now, however, they had changed their allegiances and opposed Husayn. The army urged Husayn to take a different road to Kufa, and so he did. A few days later, in the desert south of Karbala, another Kufan army intercepted and this time trapped Husayn's company. The climate was hot and dry. Husayn's company was within smelling distance of the Euphrates River, but roughly 5,000 horsemen blockaded the river, so they had no water supply. This stalemate lasted for days. Several of Husayn's followers attempted to negotiate for access to water, but they were denied. Meanwhile, many of the civilians from Husayn's party had died of thirst. Then, on the night before the battle, Husayn gathered his men and told them that they faced certain death. He announced that all his followers were free to leave camp, but none left. The next morning, the Battle of Karbala commenced. The Kufan army started the offense by showering Husayn's men with arrows. Most of the soldiers of Husayn were shot or injured then. So, in order to prevent indiscriminate injuries from arrows on Husayn's encampment, which had women and children in it, Husayn sent out his fighters into single combats. One by one, they fell. Husayn himself, being a remarkable swordsman, much like his father, defeated every opponent in single combat. Then, an arrow hit his chest. Someone else hit his head with a stone, and another man plunged a sword into Husayn. As the third Imam fell to his knees, the soldiers started looting his belongings. When the last of Husayn's band was gone, the opposing army swooped in, and to their surprise, Husayn was still breathing, praying even. He couldn't move, but he was clearly alive. As the Kufan commanders approached Husayn, someone said, "What are you waiting for? Put the man out of his misery." Then someone else hit Husayn on his head and beheaded him. His head was sent to the Caliph. The Kufan army then proceeded to loot the tents, strip the women of their belongings, and then set the encampment on fire. Anyone who survived was enslaved and brought forth the governor of Kufa. This included Husayn's only remaining son, Ali ibn Husayn. The governor sentenced him to death, but he was saved by his aunt Zainab, who was also present during the Battle of Karbala. The captives from the battle were marched to Damascus to meet the Caliph. It is during this trip to Damascus that Zainab took on the mantle of leadership. Somehow she managed to convince Caliph Yazid to release the captives and to allow them to return to Medina. On the way back, Zainab and the survivors made a stop at Karbala to mourn the death of Husayn and the others. Men and women alike, Zainab managed to inspire the survivors. She would go on and become a model of defiance, and she would play a great role in the future of the partisan movement. As for Ali ibn Husayn, the Shiites would name him the fourth Imam. Back in Damascus, Caliph Yazid, who had neglected his father's advice, believed that by force he had eliminated the Shiite factor. He couldn't be more wrong. The partisans were furious. Not only were they the underdogs of the empire, the Caliph of this empire had ruthlessly murdered and beheaded the grandson of Muhammad. The partisans wanted no part of this Islamic society. What started out as a political question over dynastic succession transformed into much more than that. The martyrdom of Husayn became a core principle in the beliefs of the partisans. It influenced their rituals, literature, music, the mindset, as well as their theology. For the Shiite identity, Husayn is recognized as the master of martyrs, and martyrdom itself became equal to redemption, and it forms a central part of their beliefs. Up until this day, Shia Muslims commemorate the Battle of Karbala in the first month of the Islamic calendar. In some countries, this ritual is experienced by self-flagellation. The martyrdom of Husayn ignited a firestorm throughout the empire. The partisans didn't just set themselves apart from the mainstream Muslim community, they became the opposition. Anyone who opposed the empire's tyranny, corruption, and the Arab nobility would find shelter and sympathy with the Shiites. This contributed to the enormous growth of the partisan movement. Furthermore, over the century, the notion of the Shiite being the underdog would find a strong support base in the lands of ancient Persia. The Persians knew what it was like to be the underdogs in the Arab Empire, and this mutual experience of harassment and suppression would in time merge the two identities into one. As for Yazid, he would die in 3 years after becoming Caliph. He went out hunting but never returned. His remains were never found. Yazid was succeeded by his son Muawiyah II, who in turn died within a year. In the meanwhile, a number of rebellions would rise and the Umayyads entered a period of internal conflicts. 2 more civil wars were fought. The Umayyads barely came out on top. It was a complex time with many dynamic changes occurring simultaneously. So, in order to deal with the setbacks, the Umayyad rulers used the jihads to redirect the focus of warfare against their neighbors, and it worked. Over the course of the century, the Umayyad Empire conquered so much that its territories extended from the Indus River to the Iberian Peninsula. For the mainstream Muslim community, the victories at the front lines and the expansion of the state were a testimony to the divine truth of Islam. This state of perpetual war brought in enormous revenues. As a result, lavish buildings were constructed, extravagant charity projects were undertaken, public displays of splendor and glory were present in every city, and never were the taxes raised. All of these points contributed to the rapid conversions to Islam. But at the same time, this system produced a side effect. The Arab nobility grew in power and influence. Arabic became the official language of the state. The Caliphate transformed itself into an Arab empire. The freedoms that the minorities enjoyed before diminished over time. Anyone who wanted to succeed in business had to learn the Arab language and convert to Islam. Anyone who didn't oblige by these rulings would continue their lives as second-class citizens. So this too contributed to the assimilation of many indigenous people into the Arabic culture and Islam. However, one group of people in particular refused to assimilate into the mainstream culture: the Persians. Their homeland was conquered and their culture was suppressed, but the Persians remained a proud people. One other group that shared this suppressed faith were the Shiites. As explained earlier, this mutual underdog experience created a bond between ethnic Persians and the Shiites. As the power and glory of the Umayyads grew, so too did the opposition increase in size. The opposition would merge with the Shiite Persian coalition, and eventually, in the year 646, about 70 years after the death of Husayn, the situation reached a breaking point. The Abbasids from eastern Persia, who were the result of Shiites merging with the Persians, rose up in a revolution and drove off the Umayyads. A branch of the Umayyad family fled across North Africa to the Iberian Peninsula, where they established the Caliphate of Cordoba. The Abbasid dynasty, over the course of centuries, would assimilate the scientific knowledge of conquered civilizations. Ancient Greek, Roman, Persian, Indian, Chinese, and Egyptian theories on subjects such as physics, chemistry, mathematics, astronomy, philosophy, medicine, and many more were translated into Arabic and Persian. This became known as the translation movement, and it paved the way for a new class of scientific scholars known as the Mu'tazila, which in turn would set the groundwork for the Islamic Golden Age. But for all of its accomplishments, the Abbasids, which started out as a Shiite revolution, ironically ended up in suppressing the partisans even more than the Umayyads. Over the centuries, the differences between Sunni and Shia Muslims would dramatically increase. This era in history, starting from Abu Bakr and ending with Hussein, explains how Islam gradually transformed into a social-political system. We can trace back the origins of Islamic jurisprudence, the rise of radical Islamic groups, and the role of women to this era in history. And unfortunately, some of the good Islamic ideas regressed over the centuries. For example, multiculturalism and tolerance for outsiders, the concept of a welfare state, and the election committee, which gives a democratic foundation to Islamic culture. In essence, this chronicle of human drama forms a central part of understanding the mindsets and identities of Sunni and Shia Muslims. In a way, both sides lost. The democratic essence of the Caliphate paved way for Muslim dynasties, and the lineage of Muhammad was lost after the 11th Imam. Neither side obtained what they had aspired for. Instead, both communities became targets for politically motivated goals. This was a Caspian report by me, Shirvan. Thank you for bearing with me through these 5 long episodes. I hope it has been interesting as well as educational. I also want to express my gratitude to the following people for their contributions on Patreon. And if you would like to support Caspian Report in producing more original content like this, please visit our Patreon page in the description. For now, thank you for watching, take care, and Sawal.